And they were just so into it and making these connections that I think sometimes we make the mistake of assuming that they're just not making. Like they're these innocent victims of like social media. And yes, there are some problems with it, but they are tuned in. They are paying attention. And it's super fun to see.
Sounds like awesome. You should be taking the parenting advice.
Yeah, that is a great point, Debbie. Oh, I'm going to go find that kid and be like, all right, give me all you got, buddy. Childhood isn't broken, but it is being reprogrammed. This is The Slow Scroll, a conversation about kids, tech, and the slow work of growing up in a world built for instant everything. We're not here to romanticize the past or panic about the future. We're here to think harder about what kids need, what adults missed, and how schools can be a place to get it right. Each episode is a chance to untangle the messy intersection of tech, identity, learning, and growth with curiosity, honesty, and a deep respect for what childhood can still be. We are talking about chapter 1 here of The Anxious Generation. We all read it this week. I don't know. Actually, Vanessa said she read it 2 weeks ago, so we're gonna have to really juice her up here and get her back into the rhythm. That was a mean way to start. And I'm sorry, Vanessa. All right, we all read chapter 1. What did you guys think?
So when I first read this chapter, I thought that there was so much content to digest with some of the data that's presented. And I feel like my big takeaway was like, there's some really interesting points made. And I'm interested in digging deeper.
I sort of admitted that I am like, for me with data and tables, especially when there's a lot of them, there was a lot of tables in this chapter. It starts to kind of go over my head a little bit, and I like to look at them and glance at them, but I don't pore over the tables. And I know a lot of what he's, building his argument around lies within those tables. And I know there's been some, opinions and questions around like the solidity of his data. Regardless, me looking at them or glancing at them, I do wish they'd been in color, but they do show trends. You know what I mean? And so to me, like whatever the cause of that trend is, I think we're going to dig into today when we talk through stuff. I think that's kind of what I'm interested in talking about.
Debbie, are you reading the physical copy of the book?
Yeah.
That was a really dumb question. I get it. Because I think I might be 11 years old. I do both when I read like professionally, like nonfiction stuff. It just helps me focus better. And so I have audiobook and hard copy in front of me. And something he says in the audiobook, not sure if he mentions it in the physical copy, is that all of those materials, all those graphs, a bunch of different things are all available online for free. And so you can go to anxiousgeneration.com/supplement, and it's broken down by chapters and different parts. And I just noticed, I meant to pull it up before we hopped on today, but I just noticed if you click on chapter 1, he's got a bunch of things. And if you scroll down, he actually has the graphs in color on. Yeah, I'm going to put them in our Zoom chat here for you. So there you go. Which does help. That actually does make a difference. And I can put
it is cool.
I can put a link to all that stuff in our show notes there. So I think I was kind of with you. We mentioned right at the tail end of our last recording that I think we like kind of said like data in quotes, because right before we were kicking this off, or we were going, one of our colleagues emailed us and said like, hey, sounds like a great idea. I've got some reservations about this book, which piqued my interest because this topic, I have a tendency to like throw like my red flags up much faster than maybe some other people, because I get a little eye rolly and just kind of fed up very quickly with people using phrases like screen addiction or talking about the dangers of screen time or that like that type of stuff, because it is far more nuanced than I think people want to make it. They just want to say like all screens are bad. Anytime you spend looking at your phone or looking at a computer or watching TV is just like unproductive, or playing video games or whatever. Like there is, as I was taking notes in this chapter, I did just write down video games ... I don't know when that's going to come up, but there's a note for me to bring it up at some point. Like, I don't know. I have a tendency to kind of like just get defensive very quickly on this topic, because it's just, I don't think it's ever been approached rationally, or it's very rarely approached rationally in my experience around like we're having a balanced middle of the road conversation around this. And one of the things that drew me to this book was I had heard that he does a pretty good job of kind of giving both sides of the argument, which I always super respect. And when I first read this first chapter, I was like, and I had my arms crossed, and my wife, who had read it first, I said, does this get better? Because I've got some questions about some of the things he said in this first chapter. Some of the stuff seems suspect in terms of, what's the false equivalencies?
Or
cherry picking
cherry picking the data.
Yeah. And we'll definitely get into this, but there's some things. One of the things that really kind of, I guess, triggered me, for lack of a better term, was the self-reporting of the data. That I don't think is scientifically peer-reviewed. Not that I'm super familiar with that process, but I think there's probably some potential flaws in there. So reading through this a second time, knowing where the book goes, I think I was able to sink myself more into it a little bit, because it's not for me so much about the data as it is about the conversations that come from it.
Absolutely. Before we go a little bit further, Stefan, I just want to acknowledge something that you said at the beginning about because you're 11 years old, you need the audiobook and the physical copy. So something that I noticed when I was working on my degrees is that I had better comprehension and retention of the information if I had those two modalities. Now, I wasn't necessarily doing them at the same time, but when we were going through like the intro, I listened to the audio intro first, and then I read, and I feel like that helped me retain that information. I did not do that with chapter 1, and I feel like that's the difference. So that is just purely anecdotal. But even, years ago when I was working at the college, I really tried to stress for students to think about, how they learn best. And sometimes it's reading, sometimes it's listening, sometimes it's both. And the tricky part was oftentimes the publishers were pushing for students to access the materials solely online. And I knew from my perspective, I needed the physical copy.
Yeah.
So anyway, just trying to encourage people to advocate on their own behalf of what works best for them.
That was the most Vanessa thing I've ever seen.
I know.
I jokingly made a self-deprecating joke, and she's like, hey, man, it's okay. You're just the nicest person on the planet.
Thanks, Stefan.
Yes.
Okay. Okay. Let's dig in. And I'm not laughing at you. I am laughing at myself, because we've worked together long enough now. I should have known that was coming, but you always surprise me somehow with just how sweet you are. That was totally unnecessary, but a very nice thing for you to say. Thank you. Let's talk about, let's dig into the chapter, part 1. So this section is titled A Tidal Wave, part 1, A Tidal Wave, and it only has the one chapter, which is titled The Surge of Suffering. Super uplifting. So,
which is why I did not want to read it.
Yeah, right. We need a whole lot of that. And look, I just did it for the first time. I just pronounced this author's name Hate. That's not his name. It's Height. Height opens the chapter with stories of parents feeling overwhelmed and powerless as smartphones, social media, and video games increasingly dominate their children's lives, eroding family connections and altering their kids' personalities. While each story is unique, they share a haunting theme. Something essential is being lost to digital immersion, and many parents feel like they're fighting to get their children back. As I read this, the first thing I wrote down is, quote, worry that something unnatural is going on. And I just wrote, that's not evidence or data. You know, like, and this is going to be my first. We talked before we started recording, and then Debbie yelled at me and said, "Save it for the podcast." Which touche. One of the we were talking a little bit about, and one of my worries with this is I'm coming from trying to recognize certain biases or privileges that I'm approaching this topic with, because I've just been very blessed in that sense, like growing up and just having two involved parents and just a healthy relationship with technology. And so I think I've got a blind spot in some of those areas. And the other one that I have is that my kids are not old enough to really fight me on tech access yet. My 6-year-old is getting there, but we're still in a world where it is so easy for us to limit their access to technology. My 2-year-old has virtually none, and my 6-year-old has access to like certain tech things very, very strategically at very, very strategic times. And so when I see things where they say like they're worried that something unnatural is going on, cards on the table, my knee-jerk reaction is, you're the parent. Right? Like, this is not, my bias coming to these things is, this is not a tech issue. This is a human issue. This is a parent issue. This is a home structure issue. Like, if we're worried about the way our kids are using devices while they're in our home, it's not as much about the phone being addicting, which I'm ready to admit that there are addicting elements about it. But the solution isn't about the phone. The solution isn't about an app for tracking your kids. The solution, I think, is about relationships and parenting.
I love that, Stefan, especially about the relationship piece, because I do think that that's so important. And so I feel like I struggle a little bit going back and forth with this chapter in particular and some of the points that you make, because I do feel like this chapter touches on something that I've observed as a parent, and kind of the difficulty in moderating screen use for my own children. And yet, to your other point that you make, like, it is an environment piece. And I feel like what I connected with what you said had to do with like capacity. And so as our lives become increasingly more complex, I think that's where the challenges lie, at least for our home, in trying to figure out that structure and that balance. And again, full transparency. During the pandemic, I was working on my master's degree and working full time. So I think my kiddos got more screen time, and not necessarily that being intentional, but when you're all at home and trying to accomplish multiple tasks, like I do have a husband who was very willing to jump in and help do things, but I think he was kind of dealing with the day-to-day tasks, laundry and dishes and that sort of thing. So we got into this negative pattern. Before I hand it over to Debbie, I just wanted to also say I've started observing, not necessarily with my oldest that's 13, where he didn't have as much tech access before pandemic, so age 9-ish. But with my younger, who is 7, I think it started off very innocent, but my husband had a tablet that he was using occasionally for coaching, and he was recording things, and then she got to see some videos that were being created. So I think it started off very harmless, but I think it quickly kind of snowballs into them wanting to do more. And I have observed when asking her to get off, sometimes there are meltdowns, and I cannot say that it is the device or the activities necessarily. I know that it is multifaceted. So, is she overly tired? Is she hungry? Is it the technology? I think those are the pieces that I want to dig in more to, but I have observed some of the challenges talked about in the book.
And I think it's one of those things, and I think we saw this a lot during the pandemic, that it's the convenience factor. It's there, and that in some ways, every generation has had the new technology that has changed the way kids interact with the world, in the times that came before that. And so I remember hearing that, people were worried about kids reading too much when books were first widely available because, they needed to be outside, they needed to be doing these things. And then I was listening to an interview the other day where they were talking about how, now we're patting ourselves on the back if we're sitting down to watch a movie together as a family. So the way our time spent together does continually evolve as the world around us evolves. And I do think that we are in a very fast-paced world. I think our culture, especially our American culture, it rewards efficiency and go, and the grind. And so with that comes busier, more complex lives, like you were saying, Vanessa. And then we get these technologies, these tools that, quote unquote, make it a little bit more convenient. And I think that's the reality that every parent, even if you have a sense that your kid, maybe your kids have too much screen time, or maybe you don't love the way it's gone, there is just this sense that it is easier, and I want to acknowledge that because even when you are trying to be really strategic about it, like when push comes to shove and you're trying to get a bunch of stuff done and it's a way to keep your kids busy, that's what it all starts with. And then yes, it can be a slippery slope. But I think a lot of it is, again, I think that it's just the level of access that is what we're seeing change, and how kids are interacting with it earlier. And obviously there are components of addiction to it. I mean, I think that's been proven enough by other studies to show what happens in the brain as kids are interacting, or humans, I should say, because I think this happens with adults too. And that was the other thing I was going to say, is just that, and it does go back to parenting, and it does go back to intentionality, and it does go back to family values, which is a privilege. I get that not everybody is in that position to say that these are the things that are going to guide every decision we make. But we have to be really honest about what we're modeling for kids and where our own attention is. There's just a lot to it. It's not one singular thing. And I think that's where people feel like, oh, he's trying to pin this on this, right? This one thing is the thing that is causing this. And I think what we're all interested in talking about today are yes, and there's a bunch of other, you know what I mean? There's more than one contributing factor, and a lot of it is just in the world we're in. And now we do know some stuff, right? 5 years ago, during the, now we know more than we did before. And so this is the time to have the conversations. Not that we have all the answers. But.
That made me think. I wrote down on my notes below this, taking away the tech isn't good enough, right? They're telling these stories about their kids, going berserk. And there's this, I think the young girl whose parents took away her phone, they found it, and she uninstalled the monitoring software, and she threatened to kill herself if they put it back on there. And there's obviously other things going on there, right? There's obviously other mental health issues that need to be addressed there. However, I think sometimes we think about like, well, it's just your phone. We're just taking away your phone. Why are you freaking out? It's not a phone. It's a social connection. And I think that's one of the big differences. It's like you are cutting these kids off, and we'll definitely get into this in later chapters, but you're cutting kids off from their social network, from their social circle. And that is a really important part of growing up. There is no more being on the planet that is more in tuned to how important social connection is than an adolescent, right? Like that is their world. That is the only thing that matters. Oh man, I was at the playground with my kids the other day, and there's this, I think high school, like probably freshman girl talking to another girl, and just, there's a part of me that made me miss the classroom, and another part that's going, man, kids are just so weird. The stories they were telling each other, but like that's how they're connecting, right? And to their credit, they're at like a park watching their younger siblings, and they're not on their phones goofing around. They're like making a social connection, but that conversation is definitely continuing outside of like from there, right? That's, you get group chats and social media and all those things. And you also said, like, I guess the other thing I was thinking is taking away tech is not good enough. You have to replace it with something, right? Like if you are going to take away a kid's phone or dedicate phone-free time, you can't just be like, all right, now you're off your phone. There has to be an alternate option. You have to like have these other things that kids can go fill their time with. And sometimes maybe that needs to be taught.
Yes, you take away their cell phone and you cut them off socially. But there was this thing back in the day called grounding, where the whole point was you cut off their social life. They come home, they stay in the house after school, they can't talk on the phone. And so I don't know why we're so afraid of it in this scenario. And on top of that, the downside, like, yes, it is their way of connecting and we need to help them navigate that in a healthy way. But when we were kids, there was a point where we went home and we were in our houses with our families and we were no longer socializing. Mm-hmm. And that, I think, is one of these pendulums, and maybe where we're not wired to have this quote unquote digital connection all night, 24 hours a day. And there needs to be a point where you're allowing your body to rest and be done with the socializing, and it's like recharge time. And I think that's the danger of just having no limits or boundaries in your home around phone usage. And again, I'm putting adults in this category and modeling, but be like remembering that boundaries are okay. And just because you can have access 24 hours a day doesn't mean you should. Mm-hmm. And so I think that if that helps parents or teachers think through this idea, like, yes, we shouldn't tell them, no, you can't have social media or be able to text your friends. However, there's a point where like it needs to, too much is too much.
Mm-hmm. There's also different reasons why we are online. So if I'm sitting at home and I'm on my phone, that doesn't always mean that I'm scrolling social media or doing Google searches or watching YouTube videos, but sometimes it's online banking or checking an appointment or scheduling something. So I think that those are also good points to have conversation around with kids in general.
Well, that's funny you said that, because I wrote down something that did not occur to me as I was reading this, but something you said made me think of it. Is my youngest, when he was in TK last year and now kinder this year, they've done fundraisers, school fundraisers, right? And I've always kind of been on my high horse, especially when I taught middle school, about there's nothing that makes me more angry than, and I'm sorry if you do this, but the parent that brings their kid's fundraiser form to their workplace and says, would you like to buy this? That kid is doing no work. They're doing nothing. They're not earning that money. They're not getting the experience that they're supposed to. They're not getting the life experience of like having to ask to support something that you're doing. Like people are making this financial commitment, right? And so Anna has heard me wax poetic about this even before we had kids. And so I was like, when our kids have to fundraise for something, they're going door to door. I will drive with them, but they will go to the door. They've got all these free tools, all these things I'd tell the teachers. Like, it's so easy for kids to make websites. It's so easy for them to whatever. It's like, our kids are doing doing that. When my son comes home from TK and they've got this little fundraiser, I'm like, it's happening. And so what we did, like, I'm not making him walk door to door, and we're not going to go ask our neighbors to do stuff. I mean, he's 5, 4 or 5 at the time. So what we did was the kid really, he's got this little toy camera. He likes recording videos. He's like seeing himself sing and dance and goof around. And so we took my phone, we together wrote like a script for it was a heavily parent influence, but like worked with him to come up with like a script to like ask relatives for money. And I supposed to like call him on the phone. So then we made a video, and so we like recorded, and it's adorable. We recorded him like doing some things and saying it and like goofing around and dancing and singing. And then I made him sit with me while I edited it together. Did he learn anything about the editing process? No, but he was invested in what we're doing, and I'm showing him the little editing program that I have. And look, we can do this. I let him pick out the music. He was involved in that process. Right? That's not him mindlessly consuming something. That's not him just freeloading and getting money for this fundraiser. We made this adorable little video that I uploaded to YouTube, made it unlisted so people can't just go find it. But then we sent it to my parents, Anna's parents, some of our close friends. And then it's like, oh, look how adorable Mike is. And then people donated for sure, but he was invested in that process. And then we did it again in kinder, and it was awesome to see him grow to be a little bit more involved. And when he is older and has the choice to say like, this isn't really for me anymore, fine, then we're doing something else. But until then, like, this is kind of his this is his carrot, and he likes it, but it's not this mindless consumption. And that's him at a computer. That is him in front of a screen. That is him, but it's very much controlled by us. And it's been really good for him. Like it has been really good for him to grow in that sense. And they're adorable. They're just adorable little videos that we get to have fun.
Yeah. Well, and I feel like what you're talking about is media literacy, because he is using his tools to send messages, to create his own message and put it out there. And I think what you're describing is, even in our primary elementary, like our primary grades, that is the level that teachers can be, quote unquote, like using tech with kids. You know what I mean? When I was in the K-2 library, we had kids making avatars. We used those when they came in. That's how they moved them on the smartboard to say where they were going in the library. You know what I mean? They learned how to log in. They could, so again, it's we've talked about this too, your digital diet, right? Are you eating digital, nutritious food, or are you eating digital junk food? And so I think that's one of these things that we need to and yes, parents, but also schools. I think that there is a point in what you just described, that whole process is using your tools and resources to create an authentic output. And that's what, schools should be about when we talk about our, ed tech skills. I'm going to bring us up to kind of the part of the book where he's talking about like that 2010. I mean, and I would say that's really sort of the purpose for all of the graphs that he puts in here, is to show this idea that 2010, with the introduction of the smartphone, which I think included the camera, this is when we see a correlation with all these other, issues, including anxiety, depression, and then he has lots of other examples too.
Yeah, so I'm going to combine these next two just because, we've been talking for 35 minutes and we're still on this first part. I'm going to combine these next two. So this is going to be a little bit longer, and then we can talk about that. So the next couple of sections are subtitled "The Wave Begins," "The Nature of the Surge," and "What is Anxiety?" So he presents data showing a sharp and globally synchronized rise in adolescent mental health issues, particularly anxiety and depression, beginning around 2010, a trend most pronounced in Gen Z and younger millennials. He distinguishes between internalizing disorders like sadness, fear, and withdrawal, and externalizing disorders like aggression and risk-taking, revealing that nearly all mental health increases on college campuses during the 2010s stem from internalizing disorders, with Gen Z showing the deepest rise. So then he moves on to define anxiety as natural, even a protective response that becomes a disorder when it's constantly triggered by non-threatening events, especially social threats like exclusion or shame. He explains how anxiety manifests physically, emotionally, and cognitively, often creating a vicious cycle of fear, distorted thinking, and social withdrawal. Depression, closely linked to anxiety, is described as a state of hopeless disconnection that worsens when social relationships weaken, highlighting how a phone-based childhood may disrupt the very relationship that protect against these rising mental health struggles. I don't know why this stuck out to me, but the internalized and externalizing disorders, and him drawing attention to that girls have a tendency to show more internalizing disorders and boys have a tendency to show more externalizing disorders. And as someone who's a father of 2 boys, that man, is that the case? They are aggressive and externalize a lot. But my oldest has a tendency to lean a little bit into that some of those internalizing symptoms. So that was very, very interesting to me.
I guess I want to talk about, and it kind of is jumping into the next section, but I think it's interesting that, he's talking about from 2010 to current time, how, all this access to these technologies, yada, yada. But I think yes, it's true that social media does have impacts and things like that. But I think it's also access to information. And so this kind of does get into that self-reporting piece a little bit, and how much of this is based off of like surveys that they did. Later in the chapter, he does get into more kind of like hard data when it comes to hospital visits and things like that. But I think a couple things that are happening along with access to information. It also is the ability to have a farther reaching audience, or receive information from a farther reaching audience. And so there's a little bit of more of like where we just are becoming more aware of different ways of thinking or different ideas that are out there. And then you do see people saying like, well, here's an experience I've had, and people might be able to like relate to that experience. And then think, we've all done that. When somebody tells you about their symptoms, you're like, have I had that? Have I ever felt that way? And so
my head also itches sometimes.
Exactly.
Oh no.
I know, exactly. And so I think that the other thing that's happening is that a lot of these things are socially appropriate to speak about. You know what I mean? Mental health and going to see a therapist doesn't have the same stigma that it 20 years ago.
Absolutely.
This is what I mean by there's more at play than just the fact that we had access to smartphones. It has a lot to do with how the world's changing, and the ability to connect, and the things that are acceptable to talk about are changing as well.
Yeah, I'd like to talk to like a clinical psychologist, or I'm probably butchering the whoever I should be talking to. So, here's something that Anna, my wife, says all the time, and she's a board certified behavior analyst, BCBA. So her job is to work with students with severe disabilities. And one of the things she talks about every now and then is that like ADD and ADHD used to be like super under diagnosed and identified. And then it kind of got brought into more light. And then it was way over diagnosed and identified, because there's this burst of like, well, we know these symptoms. And they're kind of seeing the same thing with the autism spectrum. I think like they're going through those same like kind of growing pains, because it is a spectrum disorder. And so there's all these different like identifiers and different ways, like places you could land on that spectrum. And so I definitely said this before, or did I? The thing about the article I saw with TikToks and identifying ADHD symptoms or ADD symptoms. Did we talk about that?
I don't think so.
I read this article that was like, there's this unbelievable amount of people, like adolescents, teens, who are reporting as, or like identifying as and saying they have ADD and ADHD without ever talking to a medical professional, because there are countless amounts of videos on social media pushing that, like, here's a symptom of ADD, here's a symptom of ADD. Who did I tell this to? Because I don't have TikTok anymore, but when I was on it, I'd get those videos all the time, and I'm going, and thankfully I'm a relatively fully functioning adult, if not the emotional maturity of an 11-year-old Vanessa. But I'm going, this TikTok, it's describing these things that happened to me, like trouble focusing and sticking on one task, or like these, but like, I know myself, and like, I also know the path that, like, hey, if I was really like concerned about this, my first step would be to go see a doctor or a mental health professional, or like seek a professional's advice. But if you're an adolescent, you are searching for where you fit in the world, right? You are constantly trying to figure out where you land, and you don't understand yourself. And so when someone is giving you answers that can be concrete and simple, oh, I have ADD. Oh, I'm depressed. Oh, I have severe anxiety. So blah, blah, blah. Self-diagnosing like that, I think, is crazy dangerous. And it's not, I don't think that social media is the cause of it, but it kind of passes my gut check that social media has exacerbated it like a lot, because the more you hear about it and the less authentically or appropriately it's represented, the easier it is just to imprint that on yourself. Right. And so when I read these sections about, like, in the early 2010s, like anxiety, and I see these graphs are like shaped like hockey sticks and like shoots up after 2010, because anxiety, like people reporting for anxiety, is, skyrocketing. I think those numbers, I would imagine, here's a wildly inappropriate and potentially dangerous guess. My guess would be that those numbers are inflated, but not wholly inaccurate, because when you're exposed to the social lives of others all the time, and you are constantly flooded with these hormones in your brain, and you're not supposed to be, then yeah, that is going to make you anxious. When you can be cut off from your social circle so quickly because your social circle is kind of built on styrofoam and social media, that is anxiety inducing. That makes perfect sense to me. But this like super huge increase, I think, could be inflated by people like self-reporting that ignorantly. And then he moves on to say, like, well, that he kind of says, like, yeah, maybe, but also compare this to people who are seeking treatment. I think he says in like one of the sections, like people who are seeking psychiatric care, or like suicide or self-harm rates, or there's a non-suicidal self-injury, like cutting oneself without the intent to die. That's on page 31. Like those things I think absolutely can be indicators. And I read this article that this article that came out around this same time this book was really gaining popularity, that was titled "The Parents Aren't All Right Either," which was essentially saying this stuff is affecting kids, but like parents are just as much at risk with all of this. And so like if Absolutely. I'm a parent saying I don't understand my adolescent because I've sent them around the dark side of the moon, they probably have anxiety. Then I'm going to do too much. Right? And that's the balance as a parent. It's like, how do I help and love my child without doing too much and crippling them?
Yeah, there's no right answer there. Okay, so before we change topics, I just that's where I see it as like such a tricky balance, and where I think those relationships come into play. So I'm thinking about a couple of things. So one, algorithms and echo chambers, right? So the more that you see those things, the more likely they are to present themselves in those online spaces. which can reinforce, whatever the topic is. I also think about things like natural disasters and even my own experience where I may not have seen what happened in Thailand with an earthquake or, some volcano in another country. But now that I have access, I think it's impacting me in a different way. So I think the kids that are online all the time are also experiencing this.
Well, and to your point earlier, not emotionally equipped to understand or handle it.
Yes. Yeah. Yes. They don't have all of the tools necessarily. And then the other point is that I wanted to make in connection to what you're saying, Stefan, is I feel conflicted because not everyone does have the privilege, has access to mentors or modeling to understand themselves or the experiences that they're having, or the ability to go in and see a professional to better understand themselves. So I do think that there are unique opportunities for us as a society and the kids to better understand, like, oh, I can name this feeling now, and I know how to advocate or self-advocate. So, there's positives. And then, to your point, I think the inaccurate information or misinformation, Debbie, for the media literacy piece, can also be harmful, right? Just because you have one characteristic of a disorder does not necessarily mean that you have all of those that would meet the diagnostic criteria for that. And the kiddos online at this age don't necessarily know all of those pieces or where to go to get all of those pieces or factual information, or perhaps know to self-advocate and say, I think I identified these things and now I want to go see a professional. Mm-hmm. So it's a very interesting time, for sure.
Well, and to Aristotle's point, what did he say? They think they know everything and are always quite sure about it. Have you ever tried to argue with a very confident but misinformed adolescent? There is no convincing them otherwise. That's painting with a very broad brush. But I had a 16-year-old 2 weeks ago giving me parenting advice. What are you doing, buddy? I can use a lot of help as a parent. I can. Not from you. I don't know what's going on here. This is some bad advice, buddy.
Mm-hmm. They'd probably just gone through their babysitting quarters.
Maybe.
Okay, so if it's all right, I was hoping maybe we could transition kind of around two pieces. So one, kind of the replacing play-based childhoods with phone-based ones. And then maybe we go into more of that drip feed.
So this next section outlines the arrival of the smartphone, especially the iPhone 4 with its front-facing camera, and the explosion of Instagram and social media around 2012 radically transformed how it radically transformed adolescent life, replacing play-based childhoods with phone-based ones. Side note, I, for whatever reason, have this very clear memory of when Instagram was kind of still like a budding app, and it was bought by Facebook, and a friend of mine on Facebook in college linking an article to another friend of mine saying, hey, look, Vanessa, look how much your favorite toy is worth. And it was like $2 billion. I don't know why that's cemented in my brain, but every time I hear about Instagram, that's what comes up. As teens spending nearly all their waking hours online, girls become trapped in cycles of comparison and curated self-presentation, while boys retreated into immersive and virtual worlds, setting the stage for what Haidt calls the great rewiring of childhood. Haidt addresses a common rebuttal that Gen Z is anxious and depressed because of real-world crises like 9/11, climate change, and the financial collapse, but argues that the timing and the demographic patterns don't line up. Instead of global events directly causing mental illness, he suggests that the true culprit is how these events are filtered through smartphones and social media, turning the world's problems into a constant emotional drip feed that isolates rather than energizes today's teens. So yeah, we touched on that a little bit, and Vanessa, you were talking about that.
Yeah, so I just wanted to kind of start and pose the question to Debbie and Stefan. Like, do you remember 2012 and 2010, 2012, and like what social media was at that time? Because I kind of want to push back a little bit on like the front-facing camera being the precipice of this, and maybe it truly is, but what it got me thinking about is, as a millennial, and maybe this is not a great trait, but I remember people using, digital cameras and disposable cameras, and you would take pictures of yourself, or
Your
you
nostrils.
yeah, you and a group of friends, trying to get everyone in the camera in those disposables, and then you never know if everyone actually made it until they got printed. So I feel like we started to see that even before smartphones. So I'm just curious about your own experiences that way.
Yeah, my experience is essentially non-existent. I didn't get a smartphone until kind of like way later. It was probably closer to 2014, 2015 that I got. Okay. I had this like kind of brick phone as a brand new teacher, not making a lot of money, and with some student loan debt, I wasn't splashing out for the new smartphone. And honestly, it wasn't until I was coaching softball at the middle school, and we got on the bus to go out of town on a trip, and the bus driver says, "Okay, where are we going?" And I said, "Shouldn't you know that?" And he said, and he goes, "Yeah, I mean, I know the middle school, but like, just pull up your phone to get the map to get out there." I was like, "I don't have a smartphone. I have this like flip phone." And he goes, "Oh," and that's when I realized people just expected adults to have, and so that was probably my third year teaching, probably 2015. So
and that's when you went and got a smartphone.
I was like, oh, like there's like a sense of responsibility here. Yeah, kind of. I mean, it was shortly after that I was like, I'll go, and I got my first smartphone. So I think it's not necessarily that front facing camera and like selfie stuff wasn't around beforehand. I think it's ease of access, and something that wasn't in our little summary here, but was definitely in the book is not just Instagram and the cameras and the front-facing cameras, but the filters that came along with it. And the amount of times I'll see like social connections of mine on social media just never post an unfiltered photo is interesting to me.
That's what I was going to say is I remember getting those disposable cameras, and I definitely remember getting digital cameras, but those were sort of saved for special trips. So I remember like, oh, we're going to go on a school trip. You would get one, or going to on a international trip or something was when I purchased my first digital camera. And so I feel like the difference, kind of like what Stefan is saying, is now everybody has a camera in their hand and they're documenting everything. The last time I went to a concert, I just couldn't believe the number of people watching it through their screen versus watching it. And so, I just think that it is much more handy in the use. I do want to say a little disclaimer, a little safety disclaimer on the use of filters. I heard a Washington State Patrol officer ask, kind of say, like, if you're only using filters and you don't really look like yourself, like if you're ever missing or we're trying to find you and we're looking at your social media to see what you look like, and in reality that's not what you really look like or identifiable, it has hindered responses to emergencies in the past. And I thought that was really interesting.
Angle.
He said that, yeah. He said that at the safety summit last year.
That is very, very interesting.
So
well, and what's interesting, because I've heard this as well. well, of course, millennials and Gen Z are depressed. 9/11, school shootings, climate change, financial crisis, blah, 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 like all this stuff. I wrote down, this is very flippant, but those are all adult problems. Like I remember I was 2001. So I was a seventh grader during 9/11. And that I remember not fully comprehending it. I remember it being a big deal, but it took me a little bit to go. And then all of the fallout from that and everything that happened, all the political machinations, maybe this is just me, but I was not very tuned in. Like I had other things going on. Speaking of being grounded, I was grounded a lot. And so that was what was consuming my world. I remember walking in college across campus, talking to someone that I had met in class, and he was talking to me about his major. And he goes, I said, it's something accounting, financial, whatever. I go, that's interesting. And he goes, yeah, it's interesting. You learn about all that stuff. Like today they are announcing, and it was the 2008 financial collapse. He goes, nobody knows this is coming. Like, I mean, I'm sure people were like tuned in, but he's talking about like our little insulated campus there. I was like, oh, that's a bummer. And it wasn't until I bought my first house, which would have been 2014, first house before I had a smartphone, that I was like, oh, I get it. That would have really sucked. Now, again, that's a very privileged spot, but it's also my time in life, right? Those things were not, I wasn't super worried about my 401k or my retirement plan as a 19-year-old. So I think it's easy to look at that and then imprint our anxiety as adults as we're tuned in onto kids. That being said, doom scrolling, that is a phenomenon that is not unique to Gen Z, but I think kind of had its boom era in Gen Z, right? Like, Debbie, you've mentioned before when we did that digital wellness stuff with the district out here, and one of the things we talked to them about was the cortisol and dopamine in your brain and the different facets of social media and the way phones are built to like trigger those things in your brain. And we told them emotions drive engagement, and one of those emotions is despair and anger and fear, and those things. And Vanessa, you mentioned before the term filter bubble. You will get more of that stuff the more you interact with it because it keeps you coming back. And that's that addictive nature, right? Is like these hormones affecting your brain. And it is so easy to be drip fed that, and it can just feel like everything is on fire all the time. And that leads to a lot of confusion because maybe it is, but also if you look throughout history, that's kind of the story of humanity, is things have just been on fire all the time. And I wrote down here, the burden of too much information. It's kind of what it feels like.
Yes. Yeah. So what I was going to jump in and say, sorry, Debbie, not trying to talk over you, but I'm going
to make a super cut of every time Vanessa just like needlessly apologizes. Sorry, Debbie, didn't mean to cut you off. Oh, Stefan, I'm sorry. It's going to be like 15 minutes by the time we're done with this. It's going to be excellent.
A lot I could say there, but I won't. But to your point, Stefan, when I think about what you're saying, adult problems, but I feel like that delineation is more murky with technology and this generation being online all the time. So I feel like part of our childhood or adolescence is that unless you were watching TV and specifically had the news channel or a specific type of radio station on, you could live in this space where it did not affect you and you did not hear it all the time. And to your point, news outlets knew that, fear or anger or any of those emotions did increase viewership. So I think that was kind of their angle. But now everyone has a device and they can be posting that online. So, I think about wildfires that happened in California. I think about, those natural disaster pieces, and then your mention of chemicals. As you continue to see those on, that constant feed, and then the more that you watch them, the algorithm shows you more of those things. And I don't know that while we may have conversations with this generation about algorithms and how that makes it more prevalent for them, I still don't think that developmentally they fully understand the impacts of that and how for prolonged exposure. So I'm thinking about PTSD and complex trauma. I was just reading a little bit in an article the other day about that. So complex trauma, the difference between that and PTSD is typically like an isolated incident. So like a car accident or something like that, where complex trauma is typically that longer exposure. So it makes me wonder if we as a society and this generation in particular are constantly consuming that, what are the lasting impacts of that?
Yeah. And I think that's where we're starting to know more, where we didn't, 10, 15 years ago. And I do agree with everything you said around, exposure and, younger people are coming across this and maybe aren't prepared or know exactly how to handle it other than those kind of high negative emotions, right? But I also want to point out, again, other things that have changed in the last however many years is the 24-hour news cycle. Mm-hmm. Are these TV channels that now you can access the news and hear, and it's not just the news, it's everybody's opinions about the news. And then you start getting certain like partisan channels. And so again, this idea that, it's not enough just to have the news. Now everybody has to have an opinion about it. And we're going to run segments that are just people talking about their opinions on the news, bringing in experts, but just constantly keeping that conversation going. Like that's something that has also changed. And yes, it is carried over. I feel like a lot of that now, I remember when it's like reporters get their information off of Twitter or social media before it, drops other places. And so like realizing like, this is the place that people are turning to for, right now. And then, so again, like it's not just one thing that has changed. I don't think we can say it's just the phones, but in addition to it, we have this other thing going on that is having this, I'd love to be able to call it discourse, but I don't think what we see on a regular basis online is discourse. I think it's something else that's not as nice.
People shouting at each other is what it is.
Yeah.
It's not what's not happening 24/7? Noteworthy breaking news. That's one of the worst things to come out is because you're trying to fill time. It's a money-making machine. And so kind of like what we're doing here, not that this isn't noteworthy, what we're doing here is, we read this chapter, jotted down some notes, and then we are exploring different avenues. That's the purpose of what we're creating, right? Is have an authentic conversation and kind of find avenues in there. When you're reporting the news and you're trying to fill 24 hours, somehow that feels irresponsible, and it's, we are still, I think we're potentially in a transition period where like what we know to trust, right? And that's again here, you know what? You've both said it. I'm keeping a tally mark. Now I'm going to say the term media literacy. That's that's 3 so far this episode. That's the value of media literacy, right? Is like knowing how to discern like credible information, where to go, oh my gosh, I'm not sure if I've told you this. 2-3 weeks ago, I was in a district working with some kids, the same group of kids that the one kid was trying to give me parenting advice, and they were doing digital wellness stuff, and I was so impressed. I was so impressed with them. I've got this. It's kind of a modified version of what you and I did, Debbie, and we're going through dopamine, cortisol. I'm talking about, we've got all these different media literacy terms and tactics to drive emotion. And this kid, I kid you not, goes, a lot of this can just be can be avoided if you just do a little lateral reading. I said, excuse me? And he goes, what? I go, what does that term mean? Defines it perfectly, right? I'm like, where did you hear that? He goes, oh, it's just, and there's a group about 15 of them. About half of them knew what that was. I have to explain that term to adults when I go and do the same type of presentation, and hear these 15, 16-year-olds. I was blown away. So proud. I was so proud of these kids. They kept saying things that, like, sometimes, like this presentation that, like, I've tweaked, there's like certain hammer drops about like this, and they're on the nose with all of these things, which like gives me hope. We had talked about previously kids, being critical thinkers about the way they're using technology. And I think they're more aware of these problems than maybe we give them credit for, because I had them doing this media literacy hexagonal thinking activity, and they were just so into it and making these connections that I think sometimes we make the mistake of assuming that they're just not making, like they're these innocent victims of like social media. And yes, there are some problems with it, but they are tuned in, they are paying attention, and it's super fun to see.
Sounds like awesome. You should be taking the parenting advice.
That is a great point, Debbie. Oh, I'm going to go find that kid and be like, all right, give me all you got, buddy. Okay.
Hey, go one quick question to that, Stefan, is like kudos to that student's teachers and or librarian, whoever they're working with, obviously is doing a phenomenal job. But what I wonder is, for like the average preteen teen, does that learning translate into their social life? Because I did a media literacy event in the fall, and one of the teachers taught about lateral reading and a few other strategies, and the students were fantastic. But it didn't seem as though, like, when in online spaces, non-academic, that those skills transferred.
You mean like in their personal lives?
Mm-hmm. Like before you go and share a post, like you understand that there's a feeling associated with it, but it doesn't necessarily change the behavior. I guess is the point that I'm wondering.
Yeah, no, and I think that's because we're in a fast-paced world where, in theory, yes, we would all be reading the terms of service, right? We would all be going through and being really detailed and all of these things, but that's not the nature of social media. It's to inundate you with a bunch of different images, a bunch of different things, and for you to make knee-jerk reactions on what you're going to repost or comment on or interact with, I should say. And so I've heard that same feedback on when they did the escape room on misinformation. And sure, these are all great ideas in theory, but in reality, nobody's going to take the time until I think there's a real need for it, and maybe, but I also think that this is where in our classrooms beyond ELA and maybe history, there is an emphasis on this to show that kind of piece. And I think that that's where you'll start to see it. And I mean, here's the thing, and this is kind of my gripe with media literacy, is it's always been taught in isolation or in a vacuum. Like, oh, it's this one-off lesson we do. So of course it hasn't integrated into people's regular, like, academic and personal lives. But if this is something like what we know with these types of skills are consistency. And so if they're aligned and they're consistent and there's an intentional plan on how to help students develop these, and it's something that is across all content areas, or if it's built into integrated learning experiences, then that's when you're going to start to see it become relevant and authentic. So I think there's a little bit of a call for our districts to be real. I mean, this is no longer something that you can just say, oh, we'll teach in the library if kids are lucky enough to have a certified librarian. I think we all have a responsibility around digital literacy, media literacy, and now AI literacy.
Well, and I like that you said integrated learning experiences, because as you're talking, I'm also thinking about like it has to happen at home too. This has to be a communal effort where kids are allowed to fail at that. You consider this beautiful media literacy lesson that is integrated and is authentic, and kids are interacting with those. And then I remember a friend of mine once said that there's nothing a teacher can do that is more interesting than what's happening on a kid's phone, and so you could have this really beautiful lesson and really get through the kids, and the kids really love it. But then, to Debbie's point, it's a fast-paced world, and there's some things that are biological that take over, and sometimes that takes time to seep in. And so kids need to be allowed to fail in that space and learn from it and grow and get better. And that only happens with a relationship, and like a relationship with a teacher, a relationship with a parent. I think that's something that I think about, like that stuff that I do with my son, with the little fundraiser thing. Really what I'm trying to do is foster a healthy relationship with technology. It's never too late to start. But I think if it's not translating to the social life of a teenager, that's a community effort to respond to. And you don't get to do that without a trusted relationship. And that's just going to look different at every level.
Yeah. And that's what my big takeaway from all the Screenagers films have been, is that it always comes back to communication and relationship. And I think that is hard sometimes with what you're talking about with losing our kids around the dark side of the moon, and with our busy jobs and trying to be working and parenting at the same time, keeping that balance. And so, but that is why the little things like sitting around the dinner table or having these points you check in during the week, and that you're always having these conversations. And I think that's the thing that's important that I'm working on with my own parenting is all these quote unquote hard conversations, right? So whether it's relationships, whether it's technology use, like these are not one-off conversations. These are things that are ongoing. And as kids grow and start to have more interactions in their world, they're going to need to have like that sounding board at home to talk about. And why not in class? I think that these are the types of things, these are real things to kids, and so why not talk about this? I love doing the digital wellness stuff with students because one, they do have really smart things to say, and they are way more aware than I think a lot of adults are sometimes. And two, like this is part of the skills they need to learn, is how to have that healthy balance. And so I don't know if we want to come kind of into our in some section. Stefan, do you want to kick us off with that part?
Yeah, I mean, we kind of skipped over. We touched on it a little bit. He essentially responds to the criticism by saying this crisis isn't limited to the United States. See these trends, Canada, UK, Australia, Nordic nations, also the increase. Then he concludes that the epidemic of teen anxiety and depression reflects not just external crisis, but a profound tech-driven transformation in childhood where constant digital engagement displaces vital real-world experiences. He calls for a radical reevaluation of how society raises its youth, emphasizing genuine human connection, play, and mindful technology use to restore the emotional resilience and well-being essential for future generations. So this makes me think, I will go more in depth of this. I think it'll be more relevant later, but just that piece there where a radical reevaluation of how society raises its youth, and like more human connection, more play, mindful technology use. As someone with a 6-year-old, playdates are our bread and butter, man. There is nothing that we can do to occupy, entertain our 6-year-old better than one of his peers, right? And so we're constantly, making connections with other families and trying to meet people with similar kids age, just doing the social thing. It is shocking to me, okay, with what I'm about to say, you could easily make the leap of like, well, maybe Stefan's kid is just a butt munch. He's a sweet boy, I promise you. His little brother, butt munch. My oldest is a nice kid. We are never, let me put this a different way. We are always the ones initiating play dates. Never invited anywhere. People are always willing to come hang out with us. We've got a pretty rad house. I get that, but even people that we don't know, it is. And so Anna and I have been talking about this a lot. We hear this all the time. Well, back in the 80s, kids would just play until the streetlights came on, and then they'd come home, and like that whole thing. And maybe we're just jumping the gun, and like this will, you guys would know better. This will grow a little bit more as he gets older and makes more connections at school. But he's got a ton of connections at school, and we make a point to like reach out and send notes to those families. We're the only one I can tell who's doing that, who are inviting people over for play dates. We had a kid over this weekend for the first time, and they said he is 6. This is the first time he has ever been invited anywhere for a play date. That is wild to me. Kids need to play with each other. Mm-hmm. The heck are these kids doing? What are they doing? Siblings, family, maybe that's it. We're in a community where I think there's a decent amount of families, so maybe they're connecting with cousins and brothers and sisters and aunts, uncles, that type of thing. Not exclusively. It is weird to me. And so like my takeaway from this very end of the book was like, yeah, man. Yeah, we need to be rethinking and reevaluating some of the ways that we are making social connections for our young ones. Like, what is going on here? We just plugging these 6-year-olds into iPads all day? I don't know what's happening out there, but they're having a great time when they come over. I don't know.
Yeah,
I want to make
and they're probably not on technology.
They are not.
Yeah, I think for me, it's this idea about like reevaluating how we're raising its youth, emphasizing genuine human connection, play, mindful technology use to restore this emotional resilience and well-being. And I think that I didn't need a whole chapter of his graphs and his, proof of that to still agree with that sentiment at the end, because I think whatever you want to point to, whatever the catalyst, my argument is that it's not one single catalyst. I think just the explosion of what we've seen happen in our world is a multifaceted catalyst. But yes, obviously, nobody's saying that these things aren't happening and that these aren't needs, right? These needs to come back to this human connection and this idea of like the balance of living our lives.
It resonates with me when you guys are saying we have to reevaluate what is important in society. And I guess, I'm thinking about conversations that I'm having with educators and districts around AI and, tech use and how they develop those skill sets. So if societal norms and roles are changing, why? And it's just so important to have those conversations in all of the spaces, whether that be with family and friends, whether that be in professional lives or other, so that we can be more intentional in, how we are engaging and how we're helping students to engage in these spaces, how we're modeling that for our kiddos and kind of those expectations, so that it isn't fly by the seat of our pants.
That's it for this episode of The Slow Scroll. These are messy and important conversations, and we're glad you're in them with us. If something sparked your thinking or unsettled it, we hope you'll sit with it, talk about it, and bring it into your work with kids. You can connect with us, ask questions, or provide feedback using the link to the feedback form in the show notes. Feel free to share the episode, send it to a colleague, or keep the dialogue going in your own circles. Just don't stop talking about what matters.